Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind adjust the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine.
I'm often asked, what's the one thing supercomputers can do now that they couldn't do 30 years ago? My answer was this: the fastest supercomputer of today is 100 million times faster than the fastest supercomputer of 30 years ago. The fastest supercomputer is powered by 10,649,600 commodity off-the-shelf processors. Each of those 10 million processors is proof that parallel computing is not a huge waste of everybody's time, as was alleged in the June 14, 1976 issue of the Computer World magazine. 13 years after that negative article in the Computer World, I saved everybody's time by experimentally discovering on the 4th of July of 1989 how to reduce 180 computer years of time to solution to only one supercomputer day of time to solution. I experimentally discovered how to put 65,536 processors, or as many computers, inside one supercomputer. That is, I experimentally discovered a new internet. My experimental discovery was the new knowledge of how computers can compute faster and how supercomputers can compute fastest. I experimentally discovered how to compute faster and how to do so by a factor of 65,536. That experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer made the news headlines. That experimental discovery was reported in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal. That experimental discovery is the reason American students are writing school reports on the contributions of Philip Emeagwali to the development of the computer. Back in 1974, parallel processing was a future computer industry. For that reason, my parallel processing supercomputer research was largely ignored, and I worked alone for the subsequent 16 years. The inventor hid the struggles and obstacles he overcame and hid them to make his invention appear as if it was invented in one brilliant eureka moment. It took me 15 years to invent the new supercomputer that was read in 15 minutes. During those 15 years, I was ridiculed, rejected, and mocked as the bush fowl that crowed in the language of another village. For me, Philip Emeagwali, I defined massively parallel processing as my technological quest for the speed of now from the supercomputer of tomorrow. I did so because the supercomputer of today will become the computer of tomorrow. In my quest for the fastest supercomputer, the details did not matter as long as the ending is happy. After 1989, my massively parallel processing supercomputer discovery became politicized. The obsession of haters was to knock me off my perch. After 1989, a team of American supercomputer scientists tried to steal the credit for the new supercomputer that I invented alone. For the 4 decades onward of 1974, I held those new supercomputer thieves at bay. After 44 years of their rampant criticism and derisions and mockeries of the new supercomputer that I invented alone, that team of thieves started claiming the credit for the new supercomputer that I invented alone. Those thieves told everybody that they invented the new supercomputer that encircled a globe and encircled it in the manner the internet encircled a globe. They stole my original drawings and renamed my new supercomputer from quote unquote Philip Emeagwali supercomputer. They put their names on my invention. My name was completely erased as the sole inventor of my new supercomputer. My invention of a new supercomputer that was comprised of an ensemble of commodity processors that were connected to each other and that were connected as a new internet was stolen by supercomputer scientists who publicly condemned my new internet and mocked it since 1974. To avoid legal prosecution and public shaming, they stole my new invention under a pseudonym or false name. That was the most audacious theft in the history of the computer. That theft brings into question their honesty and moral character. They stole the credit for the invention of my new supercomputer that was a new internet and stole my new technology under a number of false identities and fluid pseudonyms and stole my new computer under a number of throwaway email addresses and throwaway mobile telephone numbers. A paradigm-shifting discovery goes through 3 stages of rejection before its final acceptance. My quest for the fastest supercomputer began on June 20, 1974 at 1800 Southwest Campus Way, Corvallis, Oregon, United States. 2 years later, the June 14, 1976 issue of the Computer World, the flagship publication of the computing industry, wrote an article that was titled, quote, "Research in Parallel Processing, questioned as waste of time," unquote. Back in the 1980s, my 1,057-page research report on massively parallel processing was ridiculed, mocked, and rejected and was thrown into the trash. That mocked report was the first stage of rejection. On the 4th of July of 1989, I experimentally discovered how and why an ensemble of the slowest processors in the world could solve the toughest problems in extreme scale computational physics and solve them faster than the fastest vector processing supercomputer in the world. I was mocked by vector processing supercomputer scientists and mocked because the internal timer of my front-end computer had a timer resolution of only 1/1,000,000th of a second. For that inadequate timer resolution, I could not reproducibly time my 1/1,000,000th of a second that in turn was needed to time my world record computation speed of billions of calculations per second. It took me 6 months to resolve my hardware timer issue and indirectly resolve it via algorithms. That internal timer error made my experimental discovery to seem irreproducible, which in turn gave the naysayers a pretext to reject the massively parallel processing supercomputer. In the 1960s through 80s, research supercomputer scientists cited Amdahl's law and supercomputer textbooks when explaining why the massively parallel processing supercomputer cannot be harnessed and why it cannot be used to solve the toughest initial boundary value problems arising in modern mathematics and in extreme scale computational physics. But on the 4th of July of 1989, I, Philip Emeagwali, experimentally discovered that those titans of the world of vector processing supercomputers, such as Seymour Cray, were wrong. The supercomputer textbook was wrong because I experimentally discovered that the impossible to compute is in fact possible to compute, and I did so by using an ensemble of the slowest 65,536 processors and using that ensemble to solve the toughest problems in extreme scale computational physics and solve those problems faster than the fastest supercomputer could solve them. In 1989, that experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer won me the top prize in the field of supercomputing and made the news headlines and made vector processing supercomputer scientists that ridiculed, mocked, and rejected me to beg me to become my co-inventor and to become my new best friend. Some went as far as claiming my invention as their invention. In the 1970s and 80s, I was disowned by 4 American universities, who each objected to my pursuing my research on the massively parallel processing supercomputer. Today, each of those universities have claimed me as their quote-unquote famous alumni. Rejection is the common denominator of any breakthrough scientific discovery. If the supercomputer scientists of the 1970s and 80s understood my new supercomputer that computes across an ensemble of processors that is a new internet, then that new supercomputer is not new to him or her. And if my massively parallel processing supercomputer research discovery was accepted in the 1980s, then I was not the inventor of that new supercomputer. A discovery that is accepted at first is not a groundbreaking discovery. A discoverer that is accepted by all did not make a groundbreaking discovery. When my experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer made the news headlines, I, Philip Emeagwali, the new supercomputer inventor, had no research home other than my apartment. Before my 1989 experimental discovery of how and why parallel processing makes computers faster and makes supercomputers fastest, my country of birth, Nigeria, did not have a frame of reference in the textbook on the history of science. That historical milestone is striking when you realize that technology has improved the standard of living in Nigeria and Africa. My two grandparents at 17 Mba Road, Umudei Village, Onitsha, Nigeria, were never vaccinated. My two grandparents at 6 Wilkinson Road, Onitsha, Nigeria, never spoke into the telephone. My 4 grandparents never saw the Atlantic Ocean that was 190 kilometers away from Onitsha, Nigeria. It's technology that made it possible to travel farther than Lagos, Nigeria, and to send and receive an email to and from the United States to Nigeria. Without that frame of reference of the Nigerian supercomputer scientists that contributed to the development of the computer, studying science and technology in a Nigerian school will be like the Nigerian child watching the Olympic Games for contributions to human progress and then not seeing the Nigerian contingent at the opening ceremony. At 10:15 a.m. New York time, Tuesday the 4th of July of 1989, the US Independence Day, I experimentally discovered the massively parallel processing supercomputer. And I discovered the technology as faster than the sequential processing supercomputer. That supercomputer discovery was equivalent to the Nigerian national anthem being played during the Olympic gold medal ceremony for contributions to the development of the computer. After my 1989 experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer, I became the Nigerian that was most searched for on the internet. My experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer made the news headlines and caused a sensation within the supercomputing community. Every supercomputer scientist knew that in theory, an ensemble of processors could be fabricated or manufactured. My experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer made the news headlines because it was the first time ever that an ensemble of the slowest processors computed faster than the fastest processor that was not a member of an ensemble of processors. For that reason, my experimental discovery changed the way we look at the computer and the supercomputer. In the old way, or in the 1980s, The fastest 500 supercomputers in the world were powered by one powerful custom-made vector processing unit. That is, the old supercomputer computed with only one processor. In the new way, or after my 1989 experimental discovery, the supercomputer is supercomputing with an ensemble of commodity off-the-shelf processors that are identical to each other. My experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer is a milestone that made the news headlines because it has rich and fertile consequences. My experimental discovery of the massively parallel processing supercomputer was recorded in the June 20, 1990 issue of the Wall Street Journal, and recorded because it opened a new window in science and technology. Parallel processing is the most important discovery in the history of computational science. The importance of computational science was underscored in an article that was in the May 8, 1987 issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the flagship newspaper that presents news to universities. The article was titled, quote, "Some Hail Computational Science as Biggest Advance Since Newton Galileo," unquote. In most of the 20th century, parallel processing was terra incognita on the map of the supercomputer. Since the 1940s, supercomputer scientists speculated that parallel processing could play a role in the supercomputer of the future, but had no idea how to actually parallel process an extreme scale problem in computational physics. It was on the 4th of July of 1989 I experimentally discovered how to massively parallel process the toughest problems arising in extreme scale algebra, modern calculus, and computational physics. Parallel processing has taken the computer into a new era, making the impossible to compute possible to compute. I'm Philip Emeagwali. I've only presented to you a teaspoonful of ocean water. Trying to acquire in 60 minutes the knowledge that took me 60 years to acquire is like taking a teaspoonful of water from the Atlantic Ocean. Daalụnụ, afam bụ Chukwura Philip Emeagwali. Abụ m onye Ọnịcha. Bịa gafụ m na emeagwali.com ka o mesịa. I'm Philip Emeagwali at emeagwali.com. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Insightful and brilliant lecture. Insightful and brilliant lecture.